Hello, everyone. Today I am with Michael Vannoy Adams, and Michael is a Jungian analyst in New York City. He is a teacher, writer, speaker, painter, and photographer. Michael is also a clinical associate professor at the New York University Postdoctoral Program. So welcome back, Michael.
Thank you, John. It's always a pleasure to be with you.
Michael, we've been having a series of conversations, and we began talking about the analytic session, the beginnings of it, and the beginnings of analysis with free thinking, free association, free expression. And then last time we spoke, and we went a little more onto perhaps on the street, and how everything's, and maybe the way we ended is how things are becoming politicized. Everything's becoming politicized, maybe. And then tonight's topic is a culmination of those first two talks, maybe, and it is called the politicized psyche. So we're going to start talking about that. So I wonder, where would you like to start?
This morning it was my pleasure to have a visit in my house from my dear friend and your fellow Jungian analyst, Andrew Samuels from England.
Yeah.
Andrew was on his way to San Francisco for the 7th consecutive presidency conference of the San Francisco Jung Institute.
Yeah.
I've known Andrew for many, many years. I think we met in 1986.
Yep.
And I also, of course, was one of my favorite people on the planet was James Hillman, and I was, very privileged to feel that he and I were good friends. And so I suddenly thought back today to the whole question of politics and psychology or psychoanalysis.
Yeah.
And I had earlier been thinking about Andrew because in 1993, that's 7 years after he and I met, he published a book called The Political Psyche.
Yeah.
Now, that's not the same as the politicized psyche.
Mm.
Andrew was making some kind of statement about how the psyche is intrinsically political.
Mm.
Not that it's entirely political,
Mm.
that's the only dimension to the psyche. He was never asserting anything like that, but he was saying that politics is an important inherent dimension of the psyche. And
do you agree with that? If I could just
it's one of a gazillion archetypes is right. All I would say. So of course, okay, there is some kind of dimension.
Yeah.
And then today I was suddenly I had a thought or a stroke or something like that, and I remembered that back in 1990 I went to England, to London. I don't know whether it was in order to attend this conference. I think I must have been there for some other reason, and the conference was on. But there was a conference that the Freud Museum organized. It was called Speculations. It was at the French Institute in London, and it was organized in large part by Sonu Shamdasani,
yeah,
who was a kind of covert Jungian at the Freud Museum at that time.
Right.
It was one time in the analytic world where, for some reason, one of these sectarian or partisan institutions allowed somebody from some other camp in their midst. And Sonu was there for that moment, and they put together, he and the other people who were there at the museum put together a kind of astonishing international conference at the French Institute with all of these different kinds of people that you wouldn't think would, be in one of the separate cults. And so James had come over.
Did any fights break out, or?
Oh yes, there was an important one of Derrida's translators, or the first translator of Derrida of his book on grammatology, Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak, who's a professor at Columbia University, a big subaltern scholar, very important. She she gave a talk after James gave his talk, and she basically eviscerated him on the stage. It was really a remarkable performance. And so that was, I mean, it was it was a pretty bloody. They have the anti-vivisectionist league in England, and they should have had an ambulance standing by. Is all I can say after she got done with James and the paper that he had given.
And what was his, what was his topic, Michael? What was he talking
Well,
about?
that's the point. I'm going to tell you the title of his paper was, it's a quotation. It's like an epigram. You know, you start your book off with a quotation that's supposed to give you an idea of the entire scope of the thing, the gist of the thing. And the quotation was from Aristotle. This is 1990. This is 3 years before the political psyche. And James is making his turn. He's always turning in something. This is why David Tacey talks about twisting and turning and all this. Okay?
Yeah.
James is always turning something in the other direction. Which was something I really enjoyed about James.
Which I also love about him as well.
Yeah. And so, I mean, turn things inside out and all this.
It's just to look at them another way. That's why. It's good to look at things.
Well, I sort of always thought that James was the embodiment or incarnation of the Jungian compensatory unconscious. In The Dream in the Underworld, he trashes the theory of compensation and says he doesn't believe in it. He says the dreams are initiation rather than compensation. But this is his, like Christopher Hitchens, contrarian kind of personality at work, I believe.
It's brain food, Michael. It makes one think, doesn't it? It's not to say, oh yes, I agree exactly with what he's saying necessarily, but it does make the mind and the intellect kick into action, because you go, hang on, I haven't heard anyone say that before. They don't agree, you know. So it's kind of like it gets you going.
Well, there were people who would get very nervous around James and get angry with him because they would say things. He doesn't stand behind what he says. And it's like James was like Ralph Waldo Emerson with consistency being a foolish hobgoblin of the mind. And James
so
was
true.
not somebody who wanted to be consistent all the time. I mean, I'm much more that way. I say I have meticulosity disorder, but it's I like linearity and you know, a certain kind. I have my own style, and James had a very different kind of style.
Yeah.
And anyway, he quoted Aristotle as a gloss on the entire talk he was giving.
Yeah.
And so this is 1990, 3 years before Andrew's book. And James says, man is by nature a political animal. That's the quotation from Aristotle. Yeah. Man is by nature a political animal. And then there's a subtitle, or patient as citizen. This is when James starts talking about anima mundi, and he talks about soul in the world. He translates anima mundi as soul in the world, not the soul of the world. He makes another twist on it. He sort of distorts. I mean, he has his own subjective way with it. He's sort of taking advantage of the situation in a way and using it for his own purposes. So it's kind of cute, is what I'm saying, what he's doing there. Yeah. But it's as long as you understand what he's up to, then it should present no problem. Anyway, back in the 60s, they had made the feminists had made the big statement, the personal is political. Yeah. That's where you get the idea that suddenly people in the 60s, which is, you know, when I got interested in psychoanalysis in 1968, by reading Herbert Marcuse and all of these people, that was the first phase of psychoanalysis being politicized. Yeah. And so back in the 60s, everything is political. The personal is political. Even the personal is political. Yeah. And so now, so you have the 60s, and then you have the 90s, and now you have some other third stage of this, I think, which comes not so much from the Jungian camp. The Jungian camp is affected by it, but it's from what, and one of the things Andrew belongs to is the relational school of psychoanalysis. And he belongs to that partly through his affiliation with the NYU Postdoctoral Program, which I'm also affiliated with. And this is the relational analyst. I used to call them, when I first started becoming aware of them, psycho-relationists, because I just didn't believe that they were psychoanalysts. I thought they were doing something very different. They were relating rather than analyzing. Right. And I would, in retrospect, I would stand by that. I think that's what they're doing. I don't think they are doing what I would consider psychoanalysis. If you look in their books, and there's some very impressive people in that camp, if you look in their books, if you look in the index of their books, they don't have a lot of references under an entry for the unconscious.
Right.
The unconscious is, they talk about a transformation or a turn from what they call a one-person psychoanalysis to a two-person psychoanalysis. That's the relational turn. And what I am saying tonight, or this morning for your time, I'm saying that as I understand it now, these years later, the so-called relational turn is, by the two-person definition, the two-person psychology is a interpersonal return. It's a return with a new name. It's like there's a new franchise and they brand named it differently. Okay. They've renamed interpersonal psychology relational psychology. Now,
can I just come in here for 1 second, though, because what I need to know is how are they... I need to go back to Hillman for a second, right? Man is by nature a political animal. How is their politics different from his? Are you saying that the way they view politics is different from Hillman? Or is that the point you're making?
Well, yes. I think James was just felt that Jungian analysis and depth psychology, or Freudian analysis as well, was at that moment in, say, 1990, it seemed to him a little bit claustrophobic. It seemed to him a little bit
stuck in the consulting room.
Introverted. Introverted. When I told him I wanted to train as a psychoanalyst or be educated as a psychoanalyst, because I don't like the word training, as I wanted to become a psychoanalyst, he tried to talk me out of it. He said, well, you're the associate provost of the New School for Social Research, and we need people who understand about Jungian psychology in positions in society, doing other jobs. We don't need more analysts. And so this is around the time of, I think 1992 maybe, was when he did the world, what is it, when he does The World is Getting Worse. We've had
100 years of psychotherapy and the world is getting worse.
Yes, well.
So it's kind of like the consulting room was a little kind of morgue or something, he thought, maybe, where, it needed to get a little bit more out onto the street.
Well, yes, and then there's also just this tendency that James had to turn things inside out and to do something different. And so sooner or later, he was bound to go outside instead of staying inside. He'd done enough. He was boring him to be on the inside, I think, in some way. And so he went outside to see what fun he could have there and what he could say interesting about that. And but his politics were never conventional. Andrew Samuel's politics, it seems to me, or his way of thinking about the psyche politically, is much more conventional. And James is kind of quirky in some way. Yeah.
Can I say one thing? Is I was thinking this morning when I woke up, my main politics is to follow my daemon or the guiding spirit or something like that. So in my world, however many people there are in the world, do you know how many people there are in the world, Michael?
I don't know how many people there are in the world.
No,
I don't.
But that's almost how many political parties there should be, like each person, because so I'm not that far away from the personal is political. Like if you add in the personal and the transpersonal is political, add that to the 60s thing, it's kind of like, but everyone's got their own daemon, or in Hillman language, or their own take on it or whatever. But as soon as psychology starts to get connected to a party, that's when I start to get nervous. Like if Jung was a Democrat, if someone's trying to tell me Jung was a Democrat, as bad as the far right might be or whatever. But so is that where you're kind of heading with this? That you know, perhaps that other association in the UK is a little more connected to a political ideology or a...
Well, I'm really just thinking in two directions here. One is what I think is through this relational paradigm and just the general politicization of everything through the personal and everything else is political, that attitude, which is now, it's about 50 years old, frankly. It's about a half a century that attitude has been going on. And so we're maybe at the height of that now, the culmination of that way of thinking about things.
Okay.
What is not political in some people's minds? It's everything. And
Yeah.
I don't like to live that way. I want some respite from it. I want some, you know, to be in some other space than that all the time. It's just wearisome to have this 24/7, especially with social media and things these days. You can't get away from it.
Yeah.
But some people revel in it. I mean, I don't know what it is. I have my own speculations about, well, they must be bored because they just don't have a life or whatever. And so they just keep on doing politics.
Yeah.
But it seems to be politics at a distance. I mean, they're not really politically involved. They imagine that if they trash somebody on a social platform or tweet something,
That's
they've solved the Middle East. I don't know what. It's a magical thinking and magical speaking. It seems to me they're not. It's like those people who talk about virtue signaling or something like that. It's like it really doesn't have any effect on anything I call reality. That's my feeling about it. It's like a waste of everybody's time. It's draining everybody's libido and leaving them debilitated in the thing. And so, like, please, let's talk about something else. Can we change?
It's terribly unfashionable, but sometimes it is perhaps more profitable to go for a walk on the beach or to go into nature. Or I'm just speaking from my personal experience, but anyway, I agree. I get what you're saying.
So what I'm saying is that the analytic practice, the practice of analysis in the office, I believe what has been taking place over time is in that domain, the analyst has, in becoming more active and directive and interventive, they intervene. It's like a reversal. It used to be the individual talked for 50 minutes and the analyst listened for 50 minutes and maybe made one remark at the end of the session. That's the stereotype of the old Freudian analyst.
Right.
Hardly says anything or makes a so-called doorknob comment as you are leaving the room.
Close the door. He says, close the door.
Says, I see you mentioned your mother again, something like that, something brilliant like that. And so that was the old thing. The analyst listens. I used to say, well, it's not the talking cure, it's the listening cure. The analyst, it's the easiest job in the world in some parodic way. You just get paid for listening. Yeah. But now I believe that has been reversed, but maybe because the analyst just got bored doing nothing and getting paid for it. Now they have basically told the individual to shut up, and they're going to harangue them for 50 minutes. They're going to the analyst. I mean, the individual is told to be quiet and to listen, and then to pay for the privilege of listening to the analyst. The analyst having usurped the role of the unconscious, because in the old-fashioned way of looking at it with analytic neutrality, the only job of the analyst, it was very modest. It was not to be active or directive or interventive. It was to just remind the person to turn inward in order to know thyself and to make contact with the unconscious so that the ego could benefit from the commentary that the unconscious is making on the foibles of the ego. That was what psychoanalysis was. It was putting people into contact with their unconscious so they could understand what their unconscious was trying to desperately to say to them.
And so
about
what?
the way.
And so what happens now? Does that include political views, do you think?
Well, that's what I'm saying. Yes, it would include political views or views. I mean, they will correct you. I mean, they will. They have two things going on. One is positivity and affirmation.
Yeah.
They don't analyze you, they affirm you. They tell you there's nothing wrong with you. That's one of the things that you pay them for. Is it's like Fritz Perls, the old dirty old man of psychoanalysis. Fritz Perls said people go to analysis to improve their neurosis. These people go to be told that they're just fine. And they pay to hear repeatedly that, I mean, it's not like reassurance, but affirmation is the big word now. You affirm people.
You know,
you don't,
can I just say one thing just before we go on?
yeah.
You know what Hillman said about when Fritz Perls spoke at Esalen?
Now, what did he say?
It's like throwing pearls at swine.
Well, I thought you were going to say he says it's like throwing swine pearls. I thought, well, it's a good joke on Fritz's name.
But anyway,
Well,
sorry.
well, James had an affection for the lowest form of humor, you know, and I do too. I think that's a good one.
But getting back to,
James said, if you have a cafeteria dream, it means you're self-serving. See, that's another pun in there. But
yeah, I mean, but I think I did interrupt you from where you were. You know, what were you saying about where we're at?
well,
the
I'm
moment?
just saying there are two directions. One is what's going on in the analytic session. It's got politicized, or the analyst is now speaking for the unconscious.
So there
It's
could be a
usurped.
certain amount of bias in that, couldn't there? That's what we're saying. Because
No,
if the role of the unconscious is taken out.
they are presumptuous and righteous. They believe that they know the truth or they know morality. This is another time for us to talk about what I call psychomoralysis instead of psychoanalysis.
Yeah.
It's ideological
Yeah.
or moralistic or other kinds of things where they think they know. It used to be that the analyst was supposed to assume a not knowing attitude, like a kind of Zen master, a not knowing anything.
Yeah.
And to cultivate and help cultivate that in the individual as well. Like, what do I know? Nothing. And so therefore I turn to my unconscious to see what it has to say about things. But now it's flipped in some way, which is the analyst is somebody now who you go to, the so-called analyst you go to. You can call the person would be more legitimate to call the person a therapist or something, some other name, or a coach, as they say these days.
Yeah.
Why not? Yes, they are coaching you. To coach somebody is very different from being a traditional analyst, because the traditional analyst really is just saying, reminding you constantly when you forget the unconscious, the analyst says, remember the unconscious. The analyst says, go back and check out what your unconscious is saying. What is the unconscious commenting on? Now, that was the old way of doing analysis. That's what I still try to do.
So you believe that there's something that needs to be, well, there's a value around that.
Well, what I, as the analyst, think or say is absolutely irrelevant. The way I live my life, my philosophy of life, or any other aspect of my existence is irrelevant to the individual with me.
Yeah.
This is like, I guess in the old religious thing, you'd say it's between you and your God.
Yeah, okay.
You see, but to secularize that now and to make it psychological instead of theological, you would say it's between you and your own unconscious.
Yeah.
And I just say, I don't know anything. Jung says this repeatedly. This is Jung at his best. He says, I don't know anything. I don't have any advice to give you. I have no recommendations. All I know to do when you're stuck is to tell you to look at what your unconscious is saying. But he says, because I know the unconscious is trying to compensate the attitude, the problematic attitude of your ego. It's trying to say something that would give you a different perspective on things. And it's not like God telling you to obey. It's not insisting that you obey it. It's just asking you to consider it or to entertain it as a possibility. And you make up your own mind. That's what individuation is. It's not compliance with the authority of the deity. It's that you look at what the unconscious is saying, you take it in, you think about it, and you make up your own mind and you live your own life. That to me is what psychoanalysis is about. You see, but these other people, they're kind of programming you or wanting, they're presumptuous. Thorsten Veblen, he wrote the Theory of the Leisure Class, and he had conspicuous consumption. And my little pun these days is conspicuous presumption. I believe these psychoanalysts conspicuously presume that they know better than your unconscious and that they can speak for it.
So in a way,
Now,
in terms of Jung, it's very condescending, isn't it? And maybe a little elitist to usurp the role of the unconscious. I mean, that's what you've been saying anyway, haven't you?
Well, it is worse than that because it basically kills the profession. I mean, it does away with the whole rationale for the activity. It obliterates psychoanalysis. The psychoanalysis to me is depth psychology, or as Freud said, a psychology of the unconscious. To him, depth psychology meant a psychology. He said, what else could it be besides the psychology of the unconscious? And so once you say, well, the unconscious doesn't matter, you basically have said, we're going back to something called psychotherapy. We're not going to be, psychoanalysis is sort of an aesthetic kind of thing. It's not sexy or something like that. I mean, you don't have much of a role in a way, except as a mediator and facilitator. It's a rather modest role in your activity. I mean, you've got to be good at it. You've got to be disciplined. You have to be self-restrained. You're supposed to be neutral. You're supposed to be careful about what you say. You're not supposed to impose your countertransference on the analyst. If you have weird thoughts about your individual there, you're supposed to take it to your own analyst and analyze it so that you don't impose or inflict your nonsense on the client you have.
Well, I've got a question. I've got a question about all of this then. So if Andrew Samuels, going back to Andrew for 1 second, is going to a conference, which I think I saw the program of, it's kind of like Jungians for the Democratic Party kind of conference. I mean, sorry, I'm an observer from a long way away, but isn't that presumptive? Because I might be a Jungian. Well, I mean, this is the case. Like, I'm into Jung, right? But I don't really want to. I can't associate I'd rather be somewhere in the centre, which is a bit heterodox. I don't want to be over in party politics.
Well, that's a very big question. And let's go down that path. This is as I said, this is apparently these presidency conferences are organized by Thomas Singer, who is a very prominent Jungian analyst, and especially at the San Francisco Institute. And I like Tom a lot. He's a wonderful person. But the conference this year, and I suppose the 6 years before, you're right in, I think, what you seem to perceive, which is that it's not a conference with a lot of intellectual or political diversity to it. It's basically a group of Jungian analysts who have Democratic Party or left-wing ideological preferences. It's not the kind of conference that you would design to have a discussion or debate or to have controversy or to
have both sides of an argument.
Yeah, it's not any kind of thing. There's a presumption that we all know who you ought to vote for, I guess, is what you're saying there. I'm going to look up something here in my notes. if I can here. Yeah. In thinking about tonight, I thought there was an analyst in my group, the Jungian Psychoanalytic Association in New York, some years ago. This is the 20th anniversary of the foundation of that analytic institute, the JPA. And I was one of the founders of that. It's called the JPA because I said that's what we ought to call it. They all agreed with me finally on that. So it's the Jungian Psychoanalytic Association. I wanted to call it psychoanalytic because I didn't like the fact that Freud decided that the name psychoanalysis was, he had proprietary interests in the name, and he could dictate who used it or not.
Right.
And then he came up with this weird thing called analytical psychology, which nobody in America knows what it is. So anyway, it's the Jungian Psychoanalytic Association. And many years ago, somebody in the organization proposed as a kind of fun activity for all of us to share our favorite Jung quotation.
Right.
And it wasn't an exercise that particularly appealed to me, but I did have a favorite Jung quotation, and I did share it. And it's from The Transcendent Function,
Right.
Which is an essay that he wrote in some form in about 1916, and then lay in a drawer for 40 years or so, and was rediscovered in the 1950s. And then he revised it and somewhat, and it's published in that form in the collected works.
Right.
And so I'm going to read you this passage here, if you don't mind. It's just parts of a couple of paragraphs. This is the passage that I selected for submission as a favorite Jung quotation.
Yeah.
He's talking about active imagination. The transcendent function, he never uses the word active imagination in the essay, although by the 1950s, when the revised version was published, he was using that term, and he could have put that in there, but he's really talking about, in 1913 is when he first conducted he conducted his first experiments in active imagination. So by 1916, this was the first thing he actually wrote about it, I believe. And then so in the 1950s, we get this version. Now, this is the passage with revisions in it. There are slight revisions. They're an improvement, actually. I don't think he changed much in terms of content, but he improved the writing style, I would say.
Okay.
So this is it. It is exactly as if a dialogue were taking place between two human beings. Now, he's talking about inner dialogue and not outer dialogue.
Yeah.
Now, you and I are having an outer dialogue tonight.
Yeah.
He says the inner dialogue, that's what the it refers to, the pronoun. It is exactly as if a dialogue were taking place between two human beings. He's saying active imagination, properly practiced, is exactly like a dialogue taking place between two human beings with equal rights.
Yeah.
With equal rights.
Yeah.
Not one with better rights than the other, but with equal rights. Each of whom gives the other credit for a valid argument. You don't think that you know everything and the other person doesn't know anything, or that they're evil or any kind of thing like that. You give them credit, you give them the benefit of the doubt, at least at the beginning of the discussion, that they might have a valid point to their argument.
Well, it seems to me, Michael, what you're trying to do is be democratic here too, which is
well, I'm saying this is like a democratic document that Jung is writing here. It's like it could be in the American Constitution or something, as far as I'm concerned. It's beautifully written.
Yeah.
Each of whom, maybe he's a founding father, I don't know. Each of whom gives the other credit for a valid argument. Each one does. The two partners in the dialogue give each the other person. The other is very important here, see? The other is somebody who might have a legitimate point to make that you haven't thought about yet.
That's
so you
really, it's really good. It's really great.
Yeah.
It's great. And so, I mean, in one way, you wouldn't think that's rocket science, would you? But in the present world situation,
these days
science.
it is.
Yeah.
And considers it worthwhile to modify. See, you might change your opinion. and considers it worthwhile to modify the conflicting standpoints by means of thorough comparison. Like you might compare your ideas with the other person's idea and discussion, or else, he says, even if you don't modify anything, just to distinguish them clearly from one another.
Yeah.
You could just differentiate. In the conversation, you might come to a more differentiated idea of why you think this way and your friend over here thinks his way.
Yeah.
Then he says, then this is the next paragraph. The present day, now again, this is in the 1950s or 1960s. The present day, it's not 2024, okay, but it applies to now in spades, as far as I can tell. The present day shows with appalling clarity how little able people are to let the other man's argument count.
Yeah.
Although this capacity is a fundamental and indispensable condition for any human community. We just obliterate the idea of community or fellowship or whatever you might want to call it. We get into extreme partisanship.
It used to be called goodwill, perhaps, in the old days, or good faith, or something like that.
Yeah, that's in here too. He said, everyone who proposes to come to terms with himself must reckon with this basic problem. For to the degree that he does not admit the validity of the other person, he denies the, quote, other within himself the right to exist. So he's saying active imagination or work on your own unconscious is a function in some ways of how you treat your neighbor or your enemy or somebody else that you're in a fuss with. The degree that he doesn't admit the validity of the other person, he denies the other within himself the right to exist, and vice versa. So if you don't admit the right of the other within yourself to exist, then you can't treat your neighbor or your fellow citizen right.
Yeah.
The capacity for inner dialogue is a touchstone for outer objectivity. Now, there's Carl Jung saying it's possible and desirable to be objective. You can have goodwill toward the other person. You can give the other person the benefit of the doubt. You can credit the other person with having a legitimate argument, and you can have a dialogue. And if you can't do that, then you can't do active imagination.
And you can't be one-sided and do active imagination. Meaning,
That's right. That's right. Well, I actually say it's really interactive imagination. It's interactive imagination. And the ego and the unconscious have an equal back and forth. What he's saying, it's a dialogue from both directions.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, I think that's great. And in general, I just want to say one other thing, because I know, hopefully we can continue this, because I find there's just like that quote in itself is fantastic. You'd have to say, I'm speaking as a lefty from way back. You've always got to remember that, 60s lefty, and then graduated to Pink Floyd lefty after the 60s. But it's kind of like Jung at his time also was, you can't say he was into the cults, the sects, or the isms. He wasn't much for mob psychology. And I think to presume that Jung was a left-leaning or whatever is also a little bit, he didn't kind of go for the mob psychology, And sometimes it seems to me that as dangerous as the right might be, that the left doesn't see that shadow maybe of presumption. But anyway, Michael, what I was going to suggest, unless you had any concluding remarks, is that we continue this conversation at another time, because I know we're close to an hour now. And
well, I was looking for a particular quotation from Jung where he talks about how his attitude toward politics, which is it's not very positive, is all I would say.
Yeah.
I don't know. There are all sorts of reasons why that might be, but I would. I think he's. I don't have any problem with people being political this way or that way. But people who impose their politics on somebody else, that's when I begin to get problematic, or when they exclude other viewpoints,
Yeah.
when we can't have a conversation or a dialogue,
Yeah.
and especially when people, you see, the very idea that you would usurp the role of the unconscious, that itself is a kind of authoritarian move.
Yeah.
That's not a democratic move.
Well,
That's not.
it's a move against nature or something. You know, it's like let the dream bring something forth. You know, let nature do its healing work or something. You know.
Well, that's a big subject too, because of course people these days don't believe that in nature. I mean, they think they're Marxists maybe, but Marx actually believed in what he called objective conditions. He was a materialist, at least as a dialectical materialist, and so didn't think people just made things up, or that you could just arbitrarily identify with this or declare yourself this or that. He believed that there was a stubborn reality, which was the material world, and economics and these kinds of objective conditions. And so that's a whole other thing to get into. But politics is one dimension of the psyche. I would say there's no evidence I can tell that that psychoanalytic theories and methods privilege any analyst with having superior insight into politics over any ordinary person. So that's one of the other dimensions here. It's not just what's happened within the analytic hour, but it's the weird attitude that the analysts themselves have something special to say about the election or anything else. For the life of me, I don't get that. I don't see that. I'm more, I credit the average person more. This is your elitist thing again. There's some kind of idea that we know better from our lofty height here.
Yeah.
So anyway, thank you very much. It's always great.
Thank you, Michael. There's so much. There's always a lot, and a lot to think about from all of the things you're saying. But you know, I hope down the track somewhere, not so far away, we can continue.
Okay, good.
And
Bye-bye.
you have a lovely evening there.
Thank you.